Pure Elite Gaming.
So a few weeks ago, I did do a video in which in that video, I did say that I'm not going to talk about wrestling anymore. Well, that's partly true. I'm not going to talk about wrestling from today's standards, the wash product that it's become today. I'm not going to talk about wrestling from that perspective anymore. However, I will from time to time talk about the old school stuff and when wrestling was actually great. So who are my top 3 favorite wrestlers of all time? That's what this video is going to be about. If you click that thumbnail, you already know. So we're going to start this video off with the excellence of execution. Bret the Hitman Hart. Man, when he was wrestling, he was the best technical wrestler in the game. And this man had everything. He didn't have size, but you know what he had? He had the best technical skills in the game. He could carry anybody through a passable to great match. Like when he wrestled the 1-2-3 Kid, when the 1-2-3 Kid was a rookie. Anybody remember that match? Yeah, I just told how old I am. But anyway, when he wrestled the 1-2-3 Kid, he made the 1-2-3 Kid look like a main eventer, and the guy was only a year in the business in the WWE. That's some spectacular work right there. And also, when it mattered, Bret the Hitman Hart could tell a story. Like the stuff between the United States versus Canada during his heel run was phenomenal. I mean, he had those crowds eating out of the corner of his hand because he was delivering so well on the mic, which was quite underrated. And truth be told, another underrated fact, Bret Hart actually made Steve Austin a main eventer as well. Steve Austin was scratching at the main event, but when he wrestled Bret, that just put him over. And then he actually became a main eventer because of those matches he had with Bret. Bret the Hitman Hart was great, man. He was one of the GOATs. He was definitely the GOAT when he was wrestling. I mean, go back and look at that match he had with Mr. Perfect. I believe that was at the SummerSlam. I believe that was SummerSlam. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but that was one of the best matches I've ever seen. And anytime you watch the Bret Hart match, you always had that thought in your mind like, man, this is the best match I've ever seen. And that was why Bret the Hitman Hart was one of the GOATs in wrestling. And that's exactly why he's on my list here today. So, who's my second favorite wrestler of all time? It's gonna surprise a few people that this wrestler is gonna be so high on my list. The Viper, or Legend Killer, Randy Orton. Definitely a GOAT, man. Definitely a GOAT. The way he moves in the ring, he's always been like so evasive. It's just like his movements were always unreal. And that's part of his presentation with the whole Viper aspect of his character. Just the way he moves around and his slickness and the way how he commands the ring. He's a ring general. And Randy Orton at one point was so good, he was getting legit cheers as a heel. When the company was trying to push John Cena as the #1 babyface, and they were kind of rejecting him at that time, and like Randy Orton was like his #1 foe. Go back and look at some of those matches. There were always a "Let's go Cena, let's go Orton" chant, or they would outright boo Cena and cheer Orton. Like that just shows how great Randy Orton was. And he's still going today. He's still going. Even though the product is washed and Triple H doesn't really know what to do with him by today's standards, he's still going. And it's phenomenal. He still hits that RKO like butter. You know what I mean? He still hits that RKO out of nowhere. I think my favorite RKO out of nowhere was the one he hit on Seth Rollins at WrestleMania, where Seth Rollins had him set up for the curb stomp, and Randy Orton kind of like elevated him in the air with his shoulders, and Seth Rollins is like 11 or 12 feet in the air, and Randy Orton is just waiting for him and hit the picture perfect RKO, which was phenomenal. Like the crowd exploded. Randy Orton was just so happy that he hit that RKO. He almost didn't go for the cover. Like that was such a phenomenal moment. Another one of my favorite RKOs was when he was laying on the mat and Evan Bourne was going for his finishing move, which was called Airborne, I believe. and Randy Orton prone, he's laying on the mat, and then when Evan goes for the move, Randy kind of like kips up a little bit and catches him in the most cleanest RKO I've ever seen. Like, there are a lot of people that think that Diamond Dallas Page did a better version of the cutter with his diamond cutter. I mean, to an extent, I can see that argument, man. I could definitely see it, and I will respect any debate that anyone brings to the table stating that they feel that the diamond cutter was better than the RKO. But in my personal opinion, Randy Orton took what Diamond Dallas Page made great and he mastered it and made it his own with that RKO finish. Phenomenal, chef's kiss. Randy Orton definitely on the high end of the list here, but who's my number one favorite wrestler? The wrestling machine himself, Kurt Angle. Best wrestler of all time, in my personal opinion. Why do I say so? Well, for starters, this man was an Olympic gold medalist when he came into the WWE, so he had legitimate wrestling credentials from the jump. He had legitimate wrestling credentials, but then he adapted to the pro wrestling style of things with his promo work, with his character development, and he gave us some of the greatest moments of all time. And also, he's the best technical wrestler of all time. Now, I know I put Bret Hart on this list, and I did say at one point that Bret Hart was the best technical wrestler when he was wrestling. I stand on that. But what I also stand on was, man, Kurt Angle he could go with anybody. And he gave us some of the greatest matches that are still talked about today. This man is a GOAT, man. One of my favorite matches. Feel me on this. Hear me. Feel me. Kurt Angle versus Shawn Michaels at WrestleMania. That was a chef's kiss. Kurt Angle was the heel, by the way. And he was getting just as many cheers. Just as much of a pop as Shawn Michaels. And this is Mr. WrestleMania Shawn Michaels that he's in there competing with. And not only hanging with him, but I dare say he did better than Shawn in that match. Just saying. Just saying, he did. Another one of my favorite matches was Kurt Angle versus Chris Benoit. Well, really any of them. Anytime Kurt and Chris Benoit hooked it up, you were in for a wrestling mat classic. But my favorite Chris Benoit versus Kurt Angle match had to be when they wrestled at the Royal Rumble. Phenomenal. That was a wrestling masterpiece. And one of the things I loved about Kurt Angle, and which he showed it in this very match as well, he didn't come off as like the typical chicken heel to where he had to cheat, where he had to have people help him to win his matches. No, Kurt was legit. Like, Kurt Angle could beat you just off the strength of being Kurt Angle. And he did that in that match with Shawn Michaels that I talked about earlier in this video as well. He did that so many times. Like, he's supposed to be the bad guy, right? But he's so good as the bad guy, you can't help but to cheer him. Anybody remember Goofy Kurt? Where he was doing the backstage vignettes with Stone Cold, and they were playing musical instruments because they both were injured at the time. So that was a way to keep them both on TV. Y'all remember that, right? Remember how funny it was? And Kurt Angle was just as funny, if not funnier, than Stone Cold during those times. So he's definitely, in my personal opinion, that's my favorite wrestler of all time, man, is Kurt Angle, the wrestling machine, or as we know him today, we're going to put some respect on his name, Peak or Prime Angle. We don't call him the other version of Kurt Angle anymore because he respectfully asked that we retire that nickname, and I am going to oblige. So guys, that pretty much wraps it up here for my top 3 favorite wrestlers of all time. I'm going to also drop some honorable mentions here. Ron Simmons, who was the first recognized African-American champion in that WCW run that he had back in the early 90s. Also got to throw in there the showstopper, the Heartbreak Kid, Shawn Michaels. I mean, he's one of the GOATs as well, and he was also, one of my favorite wrestlers at the time. I just couldn't put him on this list because I was always a Bret guy, so I had to put Bret over Shawn Michaels, and that's no disrespect. Brock Lesnar And I'm going to include both of his runs with this honorable mention. When he was the next big thing and when he was the beast. Now, when he was the next big thing, like, he was hungry, he was fresh, and it was a different presentation than what we were normally seeing. I mean, he was a carnivore, man. He was a monster. He would just come out there and randomly beat up dudes, and he got over. And then when he came back as the UFC version of Brock, he was still throwing around dudes, but, you know, you could tell he aged a little bit, but you know what? That's okay. Brock Lesnar was still a GOAT. He was still, at the time, Brock Lesnar was the top draw of the company. So, I'm just saying, man. Oh, and I gotta throw just one more honorable mention in there. One more. The Tribal Chief, Roman Reigns. Not the OTC Roman Reigns, because I've talked about on this very channel how that run is washed. The Tribal Chief, Roman Reigns. By far, hands down, the GOAT in this generation. When he went on that Tribal Chief run, and he was just dominating the business and the industry, and back to back WrestleMania sellouts, I had to add him as an honorable mention on this list. But again, what do you guys think? What are your opinions? Who are your favorite wrestlers? Who should have I dropped as at least an honorable mention? Do you agree with my list or do you disagree? Sound off in the comments. Let's have a conversation. And I'll catch you on the next one.